Right now, knee-deep in what used to be Main Street, USA, or at least the rapidly gentrifying, slightly less charming version of it that I'd sunk my life savings into. A lone police cruiser, lights still strobing a melancholic blue against the murky brown water, just backed away from what can only be described as the single most ridiculous standoff in the history of emergency response. In my left hand, soggier than a week-old sponge cake, I clutched Exhibit A, a laminated HOA violation notice. Apparently, commandeering a school bus for flood evacuation purposes constituted unauthorized vehicle operation within community common areas. Try explaining that to the insurance company. My right hand, meanwhile, instinctively went for the ghost of a lukewarm chorizo burrito, remnants of which were probably now fish food somewhere around my ankles. It had been a simpler time, 3 hours ago, when my biggest concern was whether the salsa-to-meat ratio was optimal. Now I was pretty sure I'd peaked. My 15 minutes of fame were going to be less inspiring tale of urban renewal, and more that idiot who almost drowned because of neighborhood politics. Let's rewind, shall we? Because the story of how I, Alex Thompson, aspiring and increasingly perspiring urban developer, found myself knee-deep in a localized aquatic disaster zone, brandishing soggy paperwork, and mentally composing a strongly worded letter to the National Weather Service. False advertising much. All started with a building. A glorious, dilapidated, historically questionable edifice that screamed potential and quietly whispered bankruptcy. I'd always been drawn to the underdog, the diamond in the rough. While my contemporaries were flipping suburban McMansions, I was scouring the forgotten corners of the city, looking for those architectural relics that time, and probably several generations of questionable tenants, had forgotten. This particular gem, a former textile mill that had seen better days sometime around the Roosevelt administration, the first one probably, was nestled in the heart of Oak Haven, a neighborhood in the throes of what the real estate brochures optimistically called revitalization. Translation: hipsters were moving in. Artisanal coffee shops were popping up like particularly stubborn weeds, and the rent was skyrocketing. Perfect for my vision. The Loom. A cutting-edge co-working space with a ground-floor cafe serving ethically sourced, outrageously priced avocado toast. It'll be iconic, I'd told my long-suffering business partner Sarah, who mostly just raised an eyebrow and crunched the numbers, which consistently screamed, "Are you absolutely sure about this, Alex?" The purchase itself was a saga worthy of its own poorly written screenplay. Imagine a cast of colorful characters, including a reclusive elderly owner who communicated solely through a lawyer who spoke exclusively in legal jargon, a surprisingly aggressive flock of pigeons that had taken up residence in the attic, and enough asbestos to outfit a small moon base. After months of negotiations, mountains of paperwork, and a near-nervous breakdown, the Loom was officially mine. That's when I met her, Karen, president of the Oak Haven Homeowners Association. A title she wore with the self-importance of a 5-star general and the unwavering conviction of someone who just mainlined a thesaurus and a copy of the neighborhood bylaws. Our first encounter was over the aforementioned front door. I'd chosen a vibrant teal, a nod to the building's industrial past. Apparently, some textile dyes were teal-adjacent, or so I'd argued. Karen, however, deemed it a jarring deviation from the established architectural vernacular and presented me with a color swatch that could best be described as beige but sadder. "It's beige," I'd stated eloquently. "It's heritage sandstone," she'd corrected, her voice laced with the kind of condescension usually reserved for explaining basic mathematics to a particularly dense toddler. "And it is in strict accordance with Article 3, Section B, paragraph 2 of the Oakhaven HOA guidelines. Thus began my ongoing education in the arcane and utterly baffling world of homeowners associations. I learned about approved landscaping palettes. Apparently, dandelions were an invasive species. The proper receptacle placement on trash day. Millimeters mattered, apparently. And the existential threat posed by my slightly too tall mailbox. I'd tried to reason, to negotiate, even to feign ignorance, but Karen was an immovable object, a force of nature fueled by lukewarm Chardonnay and an unwavering belief in the sanctity of perfectly manicured lawns. Then came the weather report, the kind that meteorologists deliver with a furrowed brow and a tone usually reserved for discussing impending asteroid strikes. A 100-year flood, they'd warned. I'd scoffed, of course. Having lived in this city for a decade, I'd learned that 100-year events seemed to occur with the regularity of a poorly scheduled bus service. Still, Sarah, ever the pragmatist, had insisted I take precautions. "Get some sandbags, Alex," she'd advised over the phone. "And maybe don't leave your vintage record collection in the basement this time." A painful lesson from Floodapalooza 2021, involving a rare Bowie album and several gallons of murky water. Being the proactive sort, when absolutely necessary, I'd hired a team of contractors. Team might be too generous a term. It was more like a loose confederation of guys I'd found on a vaguely reputable online marketplace, promising flood-proofing solutions that sounded suspiciously like they involved a lot of duct tape and wishful thinking. Their leader, a portly gentleman named Big Tony, who smelled perpetually of stale pizza and unfulfilled promises, had assured me that his state-of-the-art, definitely not cardboard barriers would hold back the very tides themselves. I'd had my doubts, especially when I saw them measuring the potential water level with a yardstick that looked like it had been liberated from a kindergarten classroom, but I was on a budget, and they'd offered me a price that wouldn't make Sarah spontaneously combust. The rain started subtly, a gentle patter that lulled you into a false sense of security. Then it escalated, as if someone had opened a celestial fire hydrant directly over Oakhaven. The street started to fill, slowly at first, then with alarming speed. I watched from the window of the loom as parked cars transformed into miniature, bobbing submarines. Big Tony and his crew, meanwhile, were frantically applying what appeared to be industrial-strength cling film to the lower levels of the building, muttering about unforeseen structural vulnerabilities. My vintage record collection, thankfully, was on the second floor this time. Small victories. The mayor's office issued an evacuation order. A makeshift shelter was set up at the community center, a bland, beige building that ironically would have met even Karen's stringent aesthetic standards. A school bus, looking thoroughly out of place amidst the rising waters, was designated as the Evacuation Shuttle. Initially, I was determined to ride out the storm in my fortress of slightly damp hope. After all, I had Big Tony's definitely not cardboard barriers, but as the water lapped at the front steps, and I saw a family of raccoons paddling past with a distinct air of superiority, I reconsidered. Survival, it turned out, was slightly more appealing than proving a point about budget-friendly flood protection. I waded out to the street, the water surprisingly cold and carrying a disconcerting array of floating debris, including what looked suspiciously like Karen's prize-winning garden gnomes. The school bus was idling near the corner, its hazard lights blinking mournfully in the downpour. A small crowd of equally waterlogged residents huddled around it, looking a mixture of anxious and resigned. The driver, a middle-aged man with a kind face and a perpetually weary expression, was ushering people aboard. And then it happened. A dark blue SUV, gleaming even in the deluge, pulled up and deliberately blocked the bus's path. It was Karen. Of course it was Karen. Even in the face of a natural disaster, some things remained stubbornly, hilariously predictable. She rolled down her window, her perfectly coiffed hair somehow defying the humidity. "Excuse me, driver," she called out, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone about to deliver a lecture on proper etiquette. "This vehicle is obstructing a designated residential thoroughfare." The bus driver, who had clearly reached his limit of dealing with soggy humans and now had to contend with a landlocked boat mobile, sighed deeply. "Ma'am, there's a flash flood warning. We're trying to evacuate people." "Evacuate?" Karen scoffed, as if the word itself was vulgar. "And in what? A clearly non-permitted commercial vehicle. I distinctly recall no such request being submitted to the HOA for approval." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the small crowd. Even in this crisis, Karen was sticking to the bylaws. It was almost impressive in its sheer, unadulterated absurdity. "Ma'am," the driver tried again, his voice strained. "People's homes are flooding. We need to get them to safety." "Safety is paramount, of course," Karen conceded, with the air of someone granting a major concession. "Which is precisely why we have regulations. Imagine the precedent this sets, allowing any Tom, Dick, or Harry with a large vehicle to simply operate within our community without proper authorization. I swear, I could feel my brain cells committing mass suicide. This woman was arguing about paperwork while the neighborhood was turning into an impromptu Venetian canal system. "Karen!" I yelled, wading closer, the water sloshing around my waist. "What are you doing? People need to get out of here!" She turned her gaze to me, her eyes narrowing. "Thompson, your continued disregard for community regulations is noted. And might I add that teal jacket is hardly appropriate for these conditions. Have you considered a more muted, water-resistant option?" I resisted the urge to dunk her headfirst into the floodwater. "My jacket is the least of our problems right now. That bus is the only way out of here for some people." "There are protocols for emergency situations," she insisted, her voice rising. "Forms to be filled, permits to be obtained." "Karen, the forms are floating down the street," someone shouted from the crowd. It was hopeless. Reasoning with Karen was like trying to teach a brick wall to appreciate abstract expressionism. She was locked in her world of rules and regulations, oblivious to the actual, emergency unfolding around her. That's when I made the call. My fingers, surprisingly nimble despite being waterlogged, fumbled with my phone. I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency?" A tired-sounding voice answered. "Yes, hi, this is going to sound really weird, but the president of our homeowners association has trapped the evacuation shuttle with her SUV," I blurted out, trying to keep the panic, and the sarcasm, out of my voice. There was a beat of silence on the other end. "Say that again?" "Okay, so there's a flood, right? And they sent a school bus to evacuate people. But our HOA president, Karen, and yes, her name actually is Karen, has blocked the bus with her car because she says it doesn't have the proper permits." I could practically hear the dispatcher pinching the bridge of their nose. "And now we're all standing here in the rising water, arguing about bylaws while we should be, not drowning." Another longer silence. "Sir, are you saying a vehicle is obstructing an emergency evacuation?" "Yes. A blue SUV, license plate. Hold on." I squinted through the rain. Something, Karen 1. I kid you not. "And the reason for the obstruction is permit issues?" Apparently, she's quoting from Article 4, Section C, Paragraph 7, regarding temporary vehicle staging in common areas. I heard a muffled sound that might have been a choked laugh. "All right, sir, we'll send someone over. Stay where you are." "Stay where I am? Lady, I'm half fish at this point." A few agonizing minutes crawled by, punctuated by the relentless rain and Karen's increasingly agitated pronouncements about the importance of community governance. The water was now lapping at the bus's lower steps. People were starting to look genuinely scared. Even Big Tony and his duct tape brigade looked like they were contemplating abandoning ship. Then, through the downpour, I saw them. 2 flashing blue lights weaving through the submerged streets. Not a police car, but 2 police motorcycles. Their riders clad in full rain gear, looking like aquatic superheroes. They pulled up beside the bus, the roar of their engines cutting through Karen's legalistic tirade. The officers, a grizzled veteran with a handlebar mustache that could rival a walrus's and a younger, equally unimpressed-looking partner, surveyed the scene. The veteran officer looked from Karen's SUV to the stranded bus to the soggy crowd, then finally to me, still clutching my laminated evidence. He didn't even raise an eyebrow. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, addressing Karen. "You're obstructing an emergency evacuation. I need you to move your vehicle, now." Karen, however, was undeterred. "Officer, I'm the president of the Homeowners Association, and this contraption is in violation of—" The officer held up a hand, his expression unchanging. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I don't care if this is the Batmobile. It's blocking an evacuation route. Move it, or it will be towed." Karen sputtered, clearly not used to having her authority challenged, especially not by someone wearing a helmet. "But the bylaws—" The younger officer chimed in, his voice dry. "Lady, the only bylaws we're concerned with right now are the ones about not dying in a flood, and you're kind of messing with that." After a few more moments of indignant protest, Karen, realizing she was outnumbered and out-authority figured, finally relented. With a dramatic sigh that could have powered a small hairdryer, she put her SUV in reverse and grudgingly moved it to the side, nearly sideswiping a floating recycling bin in the process. The veteran officer turned to me, his gaze surprisingly direct. "All right, Thompson, was it? You seem to be the only one here with a semblance of a plan." "Plan?" I stammered. "I just called you guys." He nodded slowly. "Well, you called us about a barricaded bus. Now the barricade's gone. The bus needs to move. You got any experience driving one of these things?" I stared at the hulking yellow vehicle. My driving experience consisted mostly of navigating rush-hour traffic in my compact sedan and occasionally attempting, and failing, to parallel park without causing minor property damage. Driving a school bus in a flood? That was a whole new level of vehicular incompetence waiting to happen. Not exactly," I admitted. The officer looked at the weary bus driver, who looked like he was about 2 minutes away from spontaneously combusting from stress. "He looks about done. You're up, Thompson." "Me?" My voice cracked. 3 minutes, the officer said, his gaze unwavering. "Get it moving. We'll escort you." He gestured to his motorbike. Think of it as a very wet parade. And just like that, I found myself behind the wheel of a school bus, the engine rumbling beneath me, a bus full of soggy, anxious people looking at me with a mixture of hope and terror. 2 police motorcycles, their sirens now wailing a path through the flooded streets, positioned themselves in front and behind me. "Right," I muttered to myself, gripping the oversized steering wheel. "Don't crash. Don't drown anyone. And for the love of all that is holy, don't hit a floating garden gnome." The next few minutes were a blur of flashing lights, blaring sirens, and the disconcerting sensation of driving a large vehicle through what felt like a giant bathtub. The police officers expertly navigated the submerged streets, their bikes surprisingly agile in the water. I, on the other hand, lurched and swerved, narrowly avoiding floating debris and occasionally mounting what I sincerely hoped were just particularly large speed bumps and not submerged mailboxes. My narration throughout this aquatic adventure was a running commentary of sheer panic and disbelief. Okay, turning, gently. Too gentle. Nope. Too sharp. We're listing. Everyone brace for impact with... Oh, look, a traffic cone having an existential crisis. The faces of my passengers ranged from white-knuckled fear to bewildered amusement. A few kids were actually laughing, which I took as a good sign, either that or they were just enjoying the sheer absurdity of the situation. And then, through the rain-streaked windshield, I saw it. Karen's dark blue SUV, now listing precariously to one side, water halfway up its windows. And on the roof, looking like a particularly damp and angry figurehead, was Karen herself, still clutching her HOA rulebook, waving it like a soggy, defiant banner. Even from a distance, I could lip-read the words, "Violation, unauthorized emergency procedure." A fleeting moment of guilt flickered within me. Her car was getting flooded. That couldn't be good. But then I remembered her blocking the evacuation shuttle, and the guilt evaporated faster than a puddle in July. We finally reached the community center, which was now a chaotic hub of displaced residents, the air thick with the smell of wet clothes and nervous energy. My arrival in the police-escorted school bus was met with a mixture of cheers and bewildered stares. I felt like I should be taking a bow, but mostly I just wanted to lie down in a dry place and contemplate the existential horror of HOA regulations. My contractors, Big Tony and his soggy sidekicks, were huddled in a corner, looking remarkably unscathed, considering they'd promised me a flood-proof building that was now essentially a very large, very wet sponge. They were arguing over the last remaining donut from a box someone had brought to the shelter. Some things, it seemed, were impervious to even a 100-year flood. To my surprise, I was greeted like a hero. People clapped me on the back, thanked me profusely, and asked for selfies. I, the guy who once got lost trying to navigate a 3-block radius, was now apparently the savior of Oakhaven. It was all very surreal. Then reality came crashing down, much like the water had earlier. I got a phone call from my bank. The loom, my glorious money pit, my beacon of urban revitalization, was under several feet of water. The structural integrity was questionable. My insurance policy, it turned out, had a rather significant Acts of God clause. My dream, along with a considerable amount of my savings, was now floating somewhere in the murky depths of Oakhaven. Dejected, I found a quiet corner and sat down. The soggy HOA violation notice still clutched in my hand. This was it. My foray into urban development had ended in a watery disaster, orchestrated by a power-hungry HOA president and a questionable choice of flood-proofing contractors. But then, a figure approached me. It was the veteran police officer with the magnificent mustache. "Thompson, right?" he said, extending a hand. "Heard about your building. Tough break." "Yeah," I said, managing a weak smile. "Looks like my revitalization project got revitalized by the flood." He chuckled. "You handled that bus situation pretty well, though. Never seen anything quite like it." "Necessity is the mother of questionable driving skills," I replied. He hesitated for a moment, then reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a business card. "I know a guy at the mayor's office. They're looking for people with initiative to help with the rebuilding efforts. There might be some grants available for urban revitalization in the face of, well, you know," he winked, "acts of God and stubborn HOA presidents." A glimmer of hope sparked within me, as unexpected as a ray of sunshine after a torrential downpour. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe this was just a very, very wet beginning. A few weeks later, the floodwaters had receded, leaving behind a city scarred but not broken. Oakhaven was a mess, but there was a sense of community spirit in the air, a shared experience of having survived the ridiculous. I stood on the curb outside the loom, which now resembled a waterlogged gingerbread house. A new team of contractors was unloading equipment. They looked even more eccentric than Big Tony's crew, if that was even possible. One was wearing a hard hat adorned with rubber ducks. Another was carrying a toolbox that looked suspiciously like a vintage lunchbox. I still had the soggy HOA violation notice. I'd considered throwing it away 100 times, but somehow I couldn't bring myself to do it. It was a reminder of the absurdity, the frustration, and the unexpected heroism that had unfolded during the flood. Sarah arrived, looking remarkably put together despite the general chaos. "So," she said, surveying the scene, "you're really going to do this again?" I grinned, a genuine, non-sarcastic grin for the first time in days. "What can I say? I'm a glutton for punishment. Besides," I added, nodding towards the new contractors, "I've got a feeling this time we're going to need a whole lot more than just definitely not cardboard." And as I watched the rubber duck helmeted contractor trip over a stray bucket, I couldn't help but laugh. The urban rebirth of Oakhaven was going to be a long, messy, and undoubtedly hilarious process. And somehow I knew that Karen, somewhere in her hopefully drying out house, was already drafting a new set of bylaws to govern the reconstruction. The saga, I realized, was far from over. And maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing.